for the next 6 years and go by that? Well, there's two sets of reasons that I can offer you. The first set of reasons is more theoretical, the second one is practical. We'll start with the theoretical one. I want to give the big disclaimer that I not invented this framework at all. It instead comes from Arken Fung. It's a weird name, but now you know. Arken Fung came with this theory that I will relay to you. The idea is that we need to go beyond representative democracy, right? So first understand representative democracy. Representative democracy means that your participation is limited to two things. One, to running for office, which most people don't, 99% of people don't do that, and through voting. You vote on some typical lawyer that then is going to represent you, with air quotes, in the sense that he represents your choice for him. In theory, represents what you want, but as we'll soon see, that is not that simple, right? However, in the theory of representative democracy, this should yield two benefits, that of representation and that of accountability. In theory, it works like this. Let me go through this diagram. The representative democracy theory is the following. People have certain interests. There's certain things there's certain things that are good for them and that they would start to understand. For example, they would have an interest in getting out of poverty, or they have an interest in security, or they have an interest in the maintenance of the family and order in society. That then can translate into preferences. Preferences means that you understand what you want, and you also know how that interest would translate into some kind of politics. For example, you are against abortion because you have a certain interest in that, and you understand now that that interest in the conservative maintenance of the family translates into you not wanting abortion. That would be, and that's a good example, because this is a topic that most people have a preference about, right? That then translates itself into a signal that you would give. In representative democracy, you mainly give that signal by voting. So you would vote for the Partido Encuentro Social. In this case, you understand that they, well, they're a bad example because they will lose. But you vote for the PAN, and the PAN, you know that they will do this because they talk about it. And thus the PAN will score a number of representatives, which they did, and that gives a mandate, right? Your signal, your translate interest into preference into a signal leads to somebody getting paid by the government and getting power. Those people then are going to ideally influence policy. They're going to make policy. That policy will then be implemented, not by those people, but by administrations that you didn't elect. But they will do what the people you did elect say, and that will lead to outcomes. And those should influence your interests, and then you're happy because there's no abortion. This model has two benefits, or two functions, right? Ideally, you have representation, which means that your preferences should translate into policies. That's function A of the system. And function B is that my arrow is still there. That the outcomes of the process will be judged by you when you vote. So you have two cycles. You have a cycle of representation, you influencing policy, and a cycle of accountability. That means that the people afterwards will be judged for their actions by you, the voter. And that's the theory of representative democracy and why things should work. However, there are certain problems with this model. Not that it's a bad idea, but since it's a chain of events, things can break in a chain. If things break at the beginning, they will also fail at the end. So you must understand this as a number of, let's say, burning circles we need to jump through for democracy to work. And each of them can fail. So what are then these points of failure, these democratic deficits that we have? I made this diagram like literally 2 minutes before this class started, so I wish I could carry it to my other slides, but I can't because I didn't have time to make this class. With Sophia, right? I had 4 hours of sleep. I tried. I hope you forgive me. I tried. I had other classes too. Now, what are the deficits of this problem? And now what are the deficits of the policy process? So as I said, these chains, why the theory is good, right? This is a good idea. However, it needs to work. And there are certain points where it can fail us. First is from step 1 to step 2, from interest formulation to preferences. For that to happen, people need to understand what they want and need to understand what it means, what they want. That if they have a certain interest, they need to understand that that relates to a certain position, right? That this is the policy for them. So they don't shoot themselves in the foot with that. However, the problem is that people, we assume that voters know what they want, but that's not true. Just like when you walk into a restaurant, you don't necessarily know what you want, but when you see it, you'll want it. You're like, oh, that looks good. I want that, right? It's a bit similar with voters. Citizens don't consistently know what they want, or why. That depends a bit on the issues. Most people will have an opinion on abortion, or will have an opinion on distribution, right? These are some easy subjects that people have opinions about. About taxes, people have opinions too. But then there are fields that people generally don't have clear opinions on. My favorite one is education. Everybody thinks education is important. I yet have to meet more than 5 people that have a clear position on education, that say, yeah, it should be better, and this is how. That is rare. And everyone would agree that it's an important topic, right? But people don't, and although they go to education, have kids that go through it, they don't necessarily have a clear idea of how the policy works, or like what the options even are, like what could be an opinion on education. For that, they would need to get more informed on it. Or there might be topics that people that affect them, but they don't have an interest in it. Foreign trade, for example, or any type of foreign policy. This is not so easy for people to know about these things. After all, it's not their job. Their job is to sell insurances in the call center, right? So if we want this to actually work, right, and if we want policymakers, because policymakers don't know, right? They have to guess kind of what people want on a lot of issues. But for policymakers to know this, we would need to inform people more. People would need to get to know more about the subject before they can form an opinion on it. And they should also discuss it. If we would get people to talk to each other, to deliberate with each other, that would in itself form an opinion. Deliberation, as I think I hammered down in other classes, deliberation is an emergent property. If you talk, you're shaping your own opinion too with other people. You generally become wiser by talking to people. And so the more a topic is discussed, the higher the quality of interest formulation, the better the people know what they want, right? This is not about consensus building. They don't have to agree. They just need to know what they want, and why they want it. Not instinctively, not because, like you saw this now, Ricardo and I think yesterday did another attempt to promote universal basic income, one of his ideas. And initially, I can predict this, fun people would be like, yeah, you go and I tell it to AMLO. And then like, but wait, what is he proposing? To give money to all people? What? Hell no, right? So people's opinion can change very fast and they don't even know why. And we need to solve that. Second deficit in the public policy process is that by voting, you give a very rough signal to the politics. You like, it's not even clear if you're even voting for someone. You might be voting against someone else. So the signal that we give to policymakers is a very rough signal. It just means that we want you to be the boss. And from that, they have to interpret what you actually want, right? By the fact that you chose them, they have to guess what your opinion is on 30 different policy issues. And only so many years in between you get that signal. So it's not clear what people think about specific issues, right? For example, with the fourth transformation, it is reliable that people want the government to fight against corruption and to create more equality. These are, I think, if you voted for Morena and you don't want these two things, you just made a mistake by voting. Like you crossed the wrong thing by accident, right? Most people who vote for Morena understand that this is kind of what they're going to do. But they don't necessarily know what, or the government doesn't know what this means for the field of education, right? You vote for this government, vote for AMLO. What does that tell you about your opinions on education? Probably that you're not super elitist, but that doesn't mean much. It doesn't, they don't necessarily know what this means for security. They don't necessarily know what this means for other domains, for energy, for example, right? Are people that vote for this government ecologists? That depends highly on who they are, right? You could, they're on the left, so they're ecologists, yeah, okay, but they didn't campaign on it, so what's the signal here of the voter? Government doesn't know, because that was not what they campaigned on. So that's not clear, right? If you don't campaign on an issue, you can't say that the people voted for it if they voted for you. Plus, people's opinion might change. People, again, through deliberation or things that come up or events that happen, people might get more informed on something and now have a stronger position on it that you didn't initially know. And since in the presidential system, every 6 years, you get a chance to change something here. And we still live in a system. If you have multi-party democracy, I mean, multi-party coalitions, you have multi-party democracy, multi-party coalitions. If you have a coalition of 5 parties, or 4, like the Netherlands does, or Belgium does, like, most people will disagree with your government because they voted on 20% of that, right? Even if your party is in the government, you are 1/5 of that government. So they're gonna do 4/5 of things that you didn't want. So that's very hard to translate public signals to policymaking. Do you understand what I'm saying? Or am I sounding like some crazy old guy?
I actually did not understand. Can you repeat it again?
Okay, good. The problem here is that the idea is that through voting, we tell the leaders what we want, right? And they have an idea of what we send them to do, right? It's like you contract somebody, you say, hey, I want you to do this for me. That person is going to do that, right? Like if you would ask your lawyer to do something. But the problem is that there is no real clear description of what politicians should do in voting. You just made a choice if you want to be the leader, but they don't necessarily know what people want because of the vote. Do you understand that?
Yes, I understood that part.
A little bit. So we need more public participation to clear out or to make it more visible, the opinion of people. Moving forward, then we have the problem of accountability. Representative democracy on accountability, right? You vote for people, they either do good or they screw up, and then you will punish them for or reward them for doing good or for screwing up. That, however, only works under certain conditions. That works if policymakers actually care. If policymakers can stay in power by helping someone else than the general public, they might do so. If they, for example, can ignore you, but get a lot of money from some private interest that they then spend on advertisements to convince you anyway, they can safely ignore you, right? Because they have a way of getting, they can try to manipulate you afterwards, and they are allowed to manipulate you afterwards because they get resources from somebody else that they listen to. So policymakers might be more influenced by elites. Or, very important in our system, they're not re-electable. So they don't necessarily need to care about what you think about them afterwards, right? Their plan is to get in government, get rich, and move to Abu Dhabi. That's the plan. So they could care less what you think afterwards about how they did. And in some cases, policymakers are not even electable. For example, the army is not electable, right? What strategy they choose is you don't elect the generals. So a lot of other local policymakers are judges, etc. They were not elected, so they're not accountable. That's one of the problems we have with the judicial system, right? They could do what they want, and as long as they agree on it, there's no way we could get rid of them. And they can change policy, they can stop laws, etc. So we discussed before, they're veto players. So here we also have a problem. There must be other ways to keep people accountable besides voting. There should be other ways to check upon the government so they do what we want them to do. Lastly, we have the problem that we give the signal to policymakers and they're trying to create a certain outcome for us, but they might not be able to actually do this. We might give them a mission that they cannot carry out because that mission depends on other people, for example, on us, right? You can be mad at the government for the pandemic. At the end of the day, this virus spreads because we spread it, right? Unless you have a strict authoritarian government, if you insist on going out and living very unhealthy, there is not much they can do. And that goes for a lot of things in life. Government can make an effort, but at the end of the day, a lot depends on citizens, right? So they cannot necessarily deliver because it depends on external forces or on people or on companies, right? If you talk about pollution, for example, the government can do a lot. It should do a lot. It should do more. But for example, they cannot change. Like you can talk about refineries, we had this discussion. But at the end of the day, if you want people to drive different cars, people need to buy different cars. That's not up to the government to do so, right? They can create conditions for it, but there's certain limits. So there is also a gap between outcomes and policy, where public engagement is very important, where citizens need to actually help generate these outcomes as a form of participation. So all of these deficits can be addressed in many ways. Authoritarianism is one opposite way of addressing these problems, but that's not what we are talking about. Participation can make an effort in trying to make democracy work better. So that's one argument. That's a democratic argument. Now let's say you don't care at all, right? You got elected, you're like, screw democracy. Okay, I got more for you. I got other reasons why you might want participation. Reasons of better government, right? That you, the policymaker, would be interested in participation because it's going to make your job easier. So what are some of the advantages for, let's say, public management to engage in participation? Well, one of them is that you might just do a better job. You can provide a better service. Your policy will be more successful because you have more information, right? You want to do security policy in a certain neighborhood. If you talk to the people in that neighborhood, you could already know who the gangs are. and that will help you a lot in fighting those gangs, right? So if you invite feedback from people, you will get more information, and more information leads to a better policy process. It's evident. Second, there'll be more interaction with the citizens, which you might want, right? If you're in a dialogue with citizens, if they need to deal with you, if they want to deal with you, they're going to be more involved. And that might be good because you want them to use your service in the first place, right? They might have never heard of this service if they were not involved with it. You can now use those citizens to implement your policy, etc. But it brings citizens closer, which has big disadvantages in some ways, but it could also be in your interest as a policymaker, because now you have them at your disposal. You can make them go to the service, etc. It also leads to increased transparency, which you might not necessarily want if you are a policymaker, but you could value it, right? To accountability, you might, for example, not trust your colleagues because your colleagues are corrupt. And you're like, well, it would be better because I can't do something about it because then they'll know it's me. But hey, if the citizens would expose these scam artists, these frauds, that would be good for me, right? So it would increase transparency into public governability, which is good. Also, this is important for you as a policymaker, it could increase public confidence. There is very low public confidence in policymaking in Mexico, particularly in politicians themselves. And people in general, one of the reasons policy often fails is because people don't trust it. They don't think it's going to work, so they don't use it. If you would involve people more through information, for example, you could have higher public confidence in politics, and as your policies might up actually working because people will try to use them. And lastly, it will give you legitimacy. You might want to do things that are on a purely power politics level problematic. You will, for example, try to nationalize a certain industry, which will ruffle some feathers, right? If you make this a participatory process, you now can kind of hide behind this process. You can say, well, the people wanted it, right? Or if you want to, well, in the case of the consulta, bring to justice some very powerful people, it helps if you can say, well, me and 7 million people want this. So it can give legitimacy to your public policies. And that will help their survival. Right? It's hard to roll back something that was voted in this way. So this is some of the reasons why we might want to engage in participation. Now, from here onwards, I'm going to assume that I convinced you, Ms. Mariana, and that you actually want more participation, right? So we're going to talk about how this might be done. Do you have any questions so far, by the way? Or remarks? No.
No,
Okay.
everything's good.
Sophia tells that everything is good. I'm very happy to hear that. Now let's talk about participation and what forms it can take, because it can take various forms. There's a whole spectrum of options here. And inshallah, if God wants it, I will talk about that next time in a bit more detail, give you some more examples of what concrete forms this can take. But let's first explore the spectrum, right? There are some big variables. I'm going to stay for a while with this slide. There's some big variables in participation. Participation can have different goals, can reach different outcomes, and that depends on many things. But mainly, I think it depends on three things. It's kind of 3D spectrum that tells you what type of participation you are doing. The first thing that determines is who is participating, or who do you want to participate? The answer to that question leads to very different forms of participation and very different valuations of participation. There are three big options. First of all, you might want participation from the people that your policy applies to the audiences of your policy. That could be service users. Let's say you're talking about public transport, for example, or you're talking about healthcare, by the IMSS informing about the people who go to the IMSS. Or it could be not your clients, but the people that the policy regulates, right? Let's say you regulate food. Participation would then mean participation of the food industry in negotiating this, for example, etc. So you want input from the people that your policy is about, typically to make the policy itself better, right? A different but related approach is if you seek participation of certain communities. So these are not the people that the policy necessarily is about, but the people around that. For example, if you want to build a park, right, it would be wise to have participation, or at least consult in some way the people that live around the park. Or if you would build a prison, or if you would build things like that. This is often very problematic because communities tend to be conservative and against whatever you're going to do. But still, it is important, or it could be important, to ask them, right? Whoever is close to the policy intervention. So this is very area-based. This is geographic-based, basically. And lastly, you could ask participation from people in general, right? These are people who may or may not be involved in whatever you are trying to make the policy, public policy about. Many things in our republic are decided by people who it doesn't apply to, right? We make decisions about the army, but most people are not in the army. We make decisions about prisons, for example. It's a good example. The prison population is not a participant in penal policy, right? They're a passive subject of it. Their opinion doesn't matter. The opinion of what you think matters for how they live. So people are involved in choices that to differentiating degrees might or might not actually relate to them. So the question is, which one of these do you want, right? You want it to be only about the people that your policy applies to, or do you want the public at large? Both have consequences. If you have the public at large, you can get more consensus, you can get a bigger signal, it is democratically more valuable, but it might also be a little bit oppressive because you're going to involve the opinion of people that it's not about, who might, then again, to stereotypes and labeling and these kind of things that we talked about last time. A second variable of this variable is your sample size, right? Your participation will be stronger if you have more people in it. That's an obvious thing. But then again, your sample size relates to those things, right? Communities is not that hard to do because they are a specific number of people. Citizens in general is a bit harder to get. So the strength of your participation depends on if you chose the right type of audience for the policy you're trying to make, right? Who's relevant here, if you got that right, and how big your sample of that subset then is. By the way, quick note, citizens are not the only people in your country, right? I'm not a citizen, I'm still here. So you also need to decide that. Citizen participation is about political participation, but there are more people than the children who are not citizens, right? Well, they're citizens technically, but they don't participate in it. The foreigners, the migrants, etc. The other thing that's decisive that you might not have thought about much in the moment of participation. We have the participation cycle, right, that we talked about last time, the stages of public participation. Well, it depends a lot when exactly you ask people's opinion, right? Generally, if you ask them early, they will have a bigger chance of influencing what's going to happen. If you ask them in the problem stage, then they might completely change what you're doing, right? You wanted to do it about this, but they say, no, actually, we're not interested at all in this, but you want to do it about that. So that would be something like what the government recently did. We talked about this when INEGI had this survey about people's complaints about local governments, and the federal government actually looked at that and said, apparently people are complaining about potholes in the roads, so that's what we're going to do. That's embracing people at the very beginning of it. It's not usual, right? You could have them later in problem definition. That's also already very impactful, as we explained last time. But then you get to, choosing alternatives. You can have people make suggestions, for example, of what you could do. You could then have feedback from them. You could involve them in the selection of the policy, right? Which is already less impactful than the first step, because now they're choosing on a given choice, right? Do you want this or not? There's not an option to say, I want that other thing. That's not what is asked usually in a consultancy, right? So you just give them a choice. Then you can involve them later in the implementation. They say, okay, we're going to build a new school, but what color do you want it to be? Aha. Or, things like that. Or how do you want it? Like with my classes, for example, you are involved in the implementation phase. I asked you, sometimes I ask you, well, do you like this topic or do you want another one, right? But you don't choose the class, I think. And then at the last step, you would involve people in evaluation. That is least impactful. That has still some impact on the next round, but it's already too late, right? If it was bad. So your degree of participation depends a lot on when you ask people, right? And then the last variable is a very obvious one. It is how much power your participation process has. This is kind of self-evident. You can ask people's opinion in a lot of different ways. You can just ask their opinion and they say, that's your opinion. Or you can ask their opinion and actually use it, right? This forms a spectrum from, on the one hand, simulation, where you do things like, politicians like to do this, like they put up some kind of board and then you can put your ideas there. And then that board is thrown on some truck and never seen again, right? These are the worst politicians, where they're like, tell me what to do and I'll do it, as if, right? As if they would keep track of all the 100,000 of replies they got on their Facebook page. So you have the simulation of participation, to just asking people's opinion and okay, now we know what they want, we're not actually going to do it, to you kind of formally publicly ask them. And then you have binding referenda, non-binding referenda, and then you would have the end, you have direct democracy. There's a lot in between. It depends on how powerful the outcome is. So now we understand kind of our 3D spectrum. Let's see at what kind of things are in it, right? In general, you could say that the closer people are to actually, how you say that, to enacting the policy, the more participation there is, the better. But that's not necessarily true. We don't need most participation. We need optimal participation. You need the right type of participation for the right policy, right? Which is not always direct democracy. You need to let people participate as much as they want to, basically, as much as useful for them. So we can rank it in terms of citizen involvement. That doesn't necessarily mean that higher ranked ones are better, right? So in short, we're going to make a very rude classification and talk about information, consultation, and co-creation as your 3 options, but they break down into many, many different things that are quite distinct from each other, actually, within one category. But I'm using this as a very general framework just to talk about it with you. For first parts of participation is information. This might sound like it's not participation, but we'll get back to that, right? Information means that policymakers care that you know what they're doing. It means that instead of just making decisions, they're going to inform citizens about what they're doing, or more importantly, about what they're about to do, right? About the plans. They say, okay, we are right here now in the planning phase of our policy. And this is why we do it. A very clear example of this happens every morning at 7, are the mañaneras. This is a very far-going example of participation, right? Where the leader of the government comes, tells you every day what they're doing that day, so you know, so you can check on it, and then you can ask him any type of question. And then he also needs to give information about that, right? This is a one-way communication, or kind of semi-two-way when you can ask questions, but still, right? You're not supposed to use a mañanera to go on long rants, although people do that. That's not the idea. They usually ask a question, right? So this type of one-way participation, instance that you receive things from the government, information in this case. However, it is still quite important. The right to information is an important one. First of all, because no other parts of participation will work if you don't have this, right? If you don't know what you're deciding about, then that's not very meaningful. To accurately assess the government, you need information about them. It is very relevant to you, or it could be very relevant for you to know what professors earn, for example, or how much budget your faculty actually have. Because otherwise, if they ask you, okay, what do you want? And you're like, we want Disneyland. And like, yeah, we can't afford that. You need to know what you're deciding about. Second, information creates some kind of recognition with the government, right? People in general like to know the rules that they're governed by. And they like to know why governments do things. There's a big difference just in how it's perceived between governments just deciding something, and then now and then you see the president, like at Independence Day, or them actually explaining to you why they're doing it. The second is more respectful, because you assume that the other is an intelligent being, right? There's a recognition of you as a citizen and giving information, and there is transparency, so you can check on the government. If information didn't matter, then people wouldn't try to hide it, but they do all the time, right? If information didn't matter, then politicians would be more transparent. They typically are not. So there is a lot to hide, and there's a lot to know there. There are reasons why you cannot ask stuff to the faculty, for example. If they would be open about everything, then certain things would be hard to justify, right? And lastly, information helps with the use of services. People don't use things they don't know about, right? It's easy for the government to say, oh, for example, for Nivleon government. Nivleon government has all kinds of social services that are very suboptimal and that nobody knows about. Like you could get a state pension, for example. Don't do it because it's less than the federal pension, but you could get it. But most people don't even know this exists. For example, you don't have unemployment insurance, but you could retrieve money from your Semaphore. No, not Semaphore, what am I saying? That's not the name of it. From your Afore, if you lose your job. This typically doesn't happen because people don't even know you can do this, right? So giving information, or not giving information, is also a way of limiting costs, because you have things, you can say in theory, I have them, but nobody knows them, so they don't use them, right? Giving information also invites people to kind of exploit the government more. So that's information giving. It can come in many things, right? From a plate that announces what the government is building in a certain site, to leaders actually coming down and explaining why they're doing things, to also information campaigns, right? With health, for example, this is very relevant, this type of participation, you know. There's Zika, and they have some kind of new jingle about how you should run away from the mosquitoes. That matters in policy making. That's useful. But we are, of course, more interested in more advanced forms of participation, such as consulting. Now, consulting is a very unfortunate name here, because in Spanish, like we associate that with referenda, the consulta, but consulting is a lot more broader. You should understand more in the business sense, like consultancy agencies. By consulting, I mean the very large and kind of inconsistent collection of participation processes where policymakers try to look for the opinion of citizens, or they want to know what citizens want, or that they use their knowledge to make public policy, either citizens at large or the use of their services, right? And that type of consultancy, of course, differentiates in how much follow-up there is, right? You just want to know because you want to know, because it's interesting to know. You want to know because you're actually going to use it. You're going to know because you're obliged to use it. These are all very different outcomes. And depending on how much feedback there is, this could be a one or a two-way communication, right? Ideally is a two-way communication where the government informs you, you then informs the government back, government policymakers back, and then, very important, you tell them what you did with their feedback, right? You don't just listen, you tell them, okay, this and this and this I will care about. That and that we're going to look at, right? Because otherwise it's still a one-way communication. If the people just tell the government something, like when you evaluate professors and then nobody knows what happens with that information, that is not really consultancy. That's still one-way communication, right? The government needs to give feedback to your feedback for the cycle to be complete. That can take many forms. Oh, we lost Sophia. She's this lecture is too boring. I'm out, she said. Luckily, we still have 3 apostles that are loyal. This can take many forms that are very different in how they work, right? One typical one that we don't really have here, but it's a thing that's common in the US, are town halls or public meetings. This is when something's going to happen. Let's say they're building a new street, and whoever's responsible for that is going to be somewhere at a certain time. So I'm in that bar then, and if you want to come talk to me, I'm there. So then people come, and they generally complain to this person about what they're doing, right? That could be specific to a certain issue, like the street, as said, or it could be general, as in the mayor as this kind of open court, right? This goes back to like medieval times, where the king would just sit on his throne and he would hold court, and you would come and talk to him and say, "King, they stole my chickens," and then hopefully you do something about it. It's this type of thing, except that in modern versions, it mainly comes down to complaining, which is valuable, right? So they can know what people think, what their concerns are about something. Topic forums are a more organized form of things, where you would organize a kind of participatory event about something. For example, about housing. And at that event, so the city organizes. At the event will be different stakeholder groups, right? Let's say you have a rent association, you'd have developers, you'd have people who live in the houses, you'd have social organizations, and they would kind of, everyone's interested is there, and that's where you bring up certain topics, and then you gather information about what people think about them, and this can go a bit more detailed, right? This can go about the policy itself. They can make suggestions about how they would do it. They can say, oh, but you should take this into account, or this is going to be a problem. So this is a lot more focused on a specific thing, usually with an audience that already knows what they're talking about. Although that doesn't have to be like that. You could do it too with people who have no clue, and then the idea is that they learn about it. This is useful when we talk about subjects that people have strong opinions about, but don't actually know nothing about. Drug policy, for example, would be one of those things. Like you have an opinion on drugs, we don't actually know what they do. So it might be useful to talk with experts about this and kind of form your opinion on it. A much more limited variant of that would be focus groups. Focus groups are when a group of people come together and they're asked questions or things to debate about, and they have to, for a few hours in a row, talk about a very specific topic. Focus groups are used in many ways, right? For research, they're used to just gauge, like early on in the process, for policymakers to know how people are going to react to their policy. So these people here are just seen as information providers, right? That they're not, you don't actually care about those people's opinion in particular. You care about them representing, or you take the chance that other people think like them, right? So they're more indicative. Although focus groups could also be used very advanced in policy making if you wanted. For example, you could construct benefit lines based on focus groups. What does that mean? Let's take a policy. Money for people with disabilities, right? How much money should you pay them? It's a good question. I think our current money is kind of linked to the absolute poverty line. But what you could do is to organize focus groups. You need to do many, like 20 or so, and have people ask a question: how much money does a family with a person with disability need? But you go into detail, right? You don't just say, oh, 3,000 pesos. No. What do they need, right? So you go like item by item. They need school. They need transport. They need clothes. They need food. What food? You make like a list of what you think would be okay to receive from taxpayers, right? And then that turns into a number. And then that number you use for the policy. This typically has the effect that you get higher benefits. Because if people are asked abstractly, how much should you give to the poor? They'll say some low number. But if they have to actually think about it, they usually end up higher. Because they will go through the needs of people. This happened to some minimal extent in Belgium, and I know a research project that does it. I don't necessarily know the government listened to them, but you can use that. And it's my own unemployment insurance policy, for example, uses this. The rates of my model of how much money people get are based on polling, and not opinion focus groups. They're based on polling. They're based on excellent surveys, but still, my variables in my model are based on people's estimate of what people need, not my estimate. But again, I'm not the government. I'm a wannabe policymaker. And then surveys, right? Surveys is just where you ask people's opinion on it. So all these things are interesting and very different, but what they have in common is that people don't actually decide, right? That you want their opinion because you are going to use it for something. That's very different from, that's why I put like a red line between, from referenda. In referenda, people actually choose, like they're binding or not binding, depends. You get binding and non-binding consultancies. But that's a whole different step, right? It's a different step to have feedback or to actually then make the decision process about what people want. I group that under consulting because it's in name similar. But you understand that in quality, this is like a C gap between the two. For example, one of the more successful consultancies we did was when people could vote on the priorities of the government. This was not a policy consultancy because it wasn't organized by the government, because they were not the government yet. But this happened, right? Or the Tren Maya might be a better example. The final consultancy of the Tren Maya, which only was in the south, not in the north, right? So here they said, we don't want the public in general to decide on it. We only want people that it affects to decide on it. That happened, and that worked by and large. And people, in this case, voted yes in that referendum. But again, that's a whole different step to take. That politically works very different, right? As a policymaker, this doesn't necessarily have any benefits besides validation of your policy, because you will lose control of the policy process. But if the people do what you think they're gonna do, then it will provide a lot of momentum. We talked about it last time to your policy, and it's very hard not to do it. Like in Brexit, for example. And here is how far does the participation carry up the ladder, right? The people who run these consulting things are usually not the mayor or the governor themselves, right? They're the lower level staff. And those lower level staff might really listen to you and they might really care what you think. But the question is, are they going to use that then to inform it to the higher ups, and to what extent? Like, will it come up like just for 1 minute in a meeting? Like, what did people think? Oh, the people were angry. All right then. And next point. So you have a bunch of information at the start, right? But the quality of the information kind of decreases the higher up it goes, because it doesn't completely come true, right, to the top. The question: how much of your information actually reaches the top, and in what quality is it by that point? That's very interesting. Many options. Miss Mariana, do you have any questions? Because I just keep talking. It's a bad habit of mine. I'm not very participatory in my classes, right?
No, I don't have questions. It's pretty clear.
Okay. Then lastly, we have co-production. This is in my opinion, shady version of things, but in co-production, what it means is that you try to involve citizens in the actual delivery of the policy. So people are not just there in the planning of it, they're there in the implementations. In a steering role, which means that citizens don't have anything to do with the public policy, but they, after it's made, have control over it. So, for example, an oversight committee. Let's say you're planning a massive infrastructure project with high chances of corruption. You're building an entire new highway, for example, or you're building a canal or something like that, something big, right? A whole new highway throughout that goes all across Napoleon. You're not inviting people to plan where this road is, because it was your proposal as a policymaker. But once you're making it, you might involve people in the accounting of it. You might have a committee of people who check, for example, which contract. Very important thing to know, right? So you avoid that you hire your cousin. If you involve people, if people are literally there, like you ask who's interested, 5,000 people are. From there you have a lottery. From there you get 20 people out of that 5,000, and they are literally there on all these board meetings when you decide on who to contract, right? Or they even have directly a vote in this, like they're on the board of decision making. There's a far-reaching involvement of people into the steering of it. But once it's decided, right, that the service is going to happen, COC, it's more in how it happens. Or it could be in the service design. So we are going to have new hospitals, but you kind of in a very active feedback process involve people in the organization of that. Well, I need to think of a better example of that one, because now I say it sounds more like consulting. Well, anyway, that you would have, for example, a very short evaluation loop. So you offer certain service to people. Let's take public transport, for example, and people can propose new routes or something like that. Or you have 3 types of buses, and people can then say, okay, we like this one more. And then next time you buy buses, you go for that model or something like that. So they don't decide the public policy as a whole, that there's buses, but they have choices within that. Another variant, which is very different from it, is co-production in a more literal sense, in the sense that you and the citizens are going to implement this policy. So you're going to devolve responsibilities to citizens. In a very light variant of that, that means that you make citizens kind of responsible for themselves. So it would be something like,
would be the
roads. Are going. Tell me, please.
No, sorry, I was trying to help you with the example, like the roads in the south of Mexico that people is the one that is like making them with materials of the region.
Could you repeat all this?
Yeah, I think you're freezing. Do you hear me there?
But could you tell me again your example?
Yeah, the example of the program of this government in which people construct their own roads in the south of the country.
Mhm. But that can come in two very important variants. One, what the government does now is you hire those people to do it, right? So this is like these more artistical roads. You hire local people to do it, but you pay them. Or Sembrando Vida is another variant of that. As in, we want more trees, so we're gonna subsidize farmers to plant more trees, but they need to do it, right? We give you trees, but you need to do it. But we also pay you. A whole different variant is the old priest habit of like do-it-yourself infrastructure. They would come like, here is concrete. Go and make a basketball court. The old solidarity program of Salinas was like this. Like they would help communities by basically giving them like means of production, which sounds like you need to build your own basketball court. But here is a shovel. Go. Right, that's a less well. That's a different choice here, right? You can also get people involved in actually doing the things, or in a lighter variant. I remember Bronco had this plan. I think he never did it, but I knew he had it. There that if you wanted to fix the holes in the road, you would call and they would give you like asphalt and a shovel, like go fix the hole in the road now. I don't think that happened or ended up happening, or did it? But I remember he
Honestly,
it
I
was one
don't
of his
remember.
campaign promises. Yeah, it was
But
one
yeah,
of
I
his
remember
campaign
the campaign.
promises to do this. But that is active involvement of citizens, right? But it could also be like that you challenge them in a way, like we are going to organize a fair or a class as long as there's no trash on the floor. But if there's trash on the floor, then we're not paying for this anymore, right? So people are kind of made responsible for the policy. And if they don't do their part, then the government will stop doing their part. That's another part of co-creation. So co-production can go very different ways, ranging from giving people control over the to having people do the policy. For example, in the citizen jury, it's not here.
Teacher, sorry, it froze again.
So these are all ideas of participation.
Oops.
Now I want to end with some more. Yes. ¿Qué pasó?
Mariana was telling that like the last 30 seconds we didn't hear you well.
Okay.
The audio froze.
Well, I didn't say anything important.
Okay.
I just repeated. I just repeated what I already said. I don't know why this is happening. This is weird. I'll take off my camera and hope that works. Please tell me, Mariana, if I freeze again.
Okay.
Okay. Just scream. Like, I will know. I want to end with some critical considerations. for participation. Because it's I mean, I made a case in favor of it, but it's not that easy at all. First of all, participation is not necessarily the right thing to do. It might make public policy making a lot harder, right? It can make the public policy process a lot harder. It can slow you down a lot, to the point where you'll be too late to do anything useful. Or it constantly throws you back. Like, for example, you propose something, people don't want it. You propose something else, they also don't want it. And then like years passed of you coining ideas, and by the at the end, they realized that the first idea was the best one. So they're like, oh well, we should have done that all along, right? You waste a lot of time here. Plus, sometimes as a policymaker, as you all know, you have to do unpopular things. You, for example, if you would have consultancies about speed limits, that might be troublesome, or taxes, right? Or you might want to help migrants. People might hate that if you would ask them in general. Or for, as I said, with prisons, it's not smart to have participation, because people are gonna make it worse, right? And try to make the prisoners suffer more, in many cases. So in those cases, participation is more of a of an obstacle than an aid. Also, participation has its own deficits in terms of democracy. It can still cause a strong bias in the policy. Why? Because you usually don't consult everyone, right? Usually, if you have a consultancy process, it's going to attract certain people who are interested in influencing the process in the first place. Those people might not at all represent the majority opinion, right? If you're going to have some kind of consultancy process about urban development, for example, then it's very possible that some very motivated construction company is going to try to participate as much as possible to get things to go their way. And they just might be better organized. Like, they might stand outside with flyers, etc. Before people even made up their mind, they're already influenced by them. That's a risk here. Plus, some groups will participate more than others. It is hard to poll or to actively participate fathers, for example, because fathers are usually busy. And if you want your participation moment to be on a weekday at 2 p.m., you're not going to get them, right? Who are you going to get? You're going to get people at home, and you're going to get old people in your participation process, and maybe students, because they get time, or they at least are flexible, right? So your policy design, your participation design already is going to filter out certain groups, and therefore you need to find them, and that can be hard, right? Often the groups whose opinion is actually most important can be the hardest ones to reach. In poverty policy, this is evident. With certain minorities, right? With indigenous people, for example, they're not that cooperative often to start with. There's all kind of barriers of language, and so it's very, very hard to get them. And if you do get them, you're going to get their elites. You're going to get like the most educated versions of those communities, who are not fully representative of the community itself, right? And lastly, policymakers can, of course, manipulate participation by flat out cheating and just changing the input. Or by using it as a way, well, to put pressure, etc., which might not be good, but it does cause a certain bias in it, right? Or by offering people only a limited set of options, etc., by giving them false information. This is possible to do. So if we want to do things right, we need to overcome a certain number of obstacles. One of the ones that we need to overcome, that's the biggest, one of the biggest ones, sorry, I talked too fast, is apathy. There is general apathy towards policy making in society. Apathy means that you don't care. That's because people love complaining about things, but they don't actually want to get involved, right? People like to say something is a bad idea. It's not hard to say, well, what should we do then? People increasingly like complaining, that's a good thing, but not much participating. So if you are going to organize a participatory process, you should understand that realistically, you're going to get between 5 and 20% of the people you're trying to reach, whether that's population in general or the community, right? And that's if you would be technically able to reach them all, right? Which in almost all cases you're not. But if you would have the resources to like go to every door, unless you force people, 5 to 20% of people are going to answer. That's in general, if you look at opinion polling, people who want to be more involved with government. The majority will say, I just want to vote, leave me alone. It's Sunday, I'm going to watch football, bye. And they don't want anything to do with it. Or they are too busy, right? So that's what you should aim for. And that already helps to understand that this is what you're aiming for, right? So, for example, that's why consultas are a bit problematic if you have a 40% margin, because that's very unrealistic unless it gets the character of an election, right? That you're deciding about the leaders themselves, maybe. But in general, it is hard to reach enough people. And that depends on a lot of things, right? If you reach them or not. It depends on the topic. People have stronger preferences on certain topics than others. It also depends on if the people think that it's going to matter. If people think it's not going to matter anyway, they're not going to come. Or if they think that it's simulation, they're also not going to come. Right? They must have a sense of impact, which you can partly control by giving feedback. That's why feedback is very important. If people tell you something, the faster you can get back to them and say, oh yeah, this is what we decided, right? If they agree with you or not, that doesn't matter. What matters is that they know that you didn't forget, that this was not just a formalistic exercise, right? You can increase that with it. Also, setting expectations matters. What you don't want is disappointment. You don't want people to come into a participatory process thinking that, you know, the end result could be that Nivelion becomes independent. If you're talking about, you know, about the metro, like that's not going to happen. And people should come into this meeting talking about this kind of things, right? They should understand what you're trying to do. In my own research again, when I explained we do research on loans, a lot of people that contact us thinks that we are the police and that we can actually help them. It's very painful when you have to tell me that no, we are trying to inform public policy. We are not lawyers. We cannot actually sue these people for you, right? And that can piss them off. So it's good if they know on forehand why exactly they're coming to you. Then also there is level of information people have, right? People know more what it's about. So that's one kind of barrier you need to overcome. Also, your participation must actually be within your capacity. There are organizational limits to what you can do, right? We talked about these variables in public policy. Well, they're also dictated by how much resource. You need to balance a certain amount of things. You need to ask yourself, okay, how much people can I actually reach? Like what's realistic? How much money do I have to do this, right? And decide your method. Survey is not that difficult. A town hall is also not that difficult. You could do it in open air. You could just sit in the park, have people come. Focus groups are a bit more expensive. Some kind of like forum that you organize, now you need catering, etc. That's a lot more expensive, right? Sits and juries even more expensive. You need to start paying people, etc. How much time there is. This is a very important one. The longer participation process takes, the better information you get, right? but A, the longer your own policy process is going to be, and B, the more tired people are going to be. There's a lot of things that would be very interesting to measure if only people would have the patience to stay with it, right? For example, people's opinion, how it changes over time. That's interesting. But at some point, people are going to be sick of going on Sunday afternoons to these meetings and just going to drop out. So how long your participation process is, you need to take into account. Maybe you don't have enough time. Maybe you can't afford enough time. It's a factor. And of course, the capacity of the respondents. You need to know how knowledgeable or how ignorant the audience is. If they don't know much about it, you shouldn't start with technical questions, right? You should not let them be in charge of the policy design if they don't even understand the problem. On the other hand, if they are users, for example, then they can be more involved in it, right? So it's about choosing the right participation method for the right thing, given the resources you have. And lastly, an obstacle is that you don't want to organize participation over things that you don't have power. This is particularly a problem for local governments, because local governments need to deal with a lot of problems that they cannot change, right? They cannot change the minimum wage, although the minimum wage might be very relevant. They cannot control where the Guardia Nacional is going to be, right? They can invite them to have a military base in their city, but if people want that in some kind of open door policy making about security, they can't actually deliver. They can just say, oh, we're going to ask the federal government, right? So this is problematic. It's easiest on the highest level, because then you could actually do what people want. But if you have participation process on a local level and you can't actually do much, this is going to be a waste of time and money, right? Because people are going to demand all kinds of things you can't do. They're going to be angry. You're going to feel powerless, and there was no use to it. So policymakers also need to be capable of doing that. And lastly, participation itself can also feed into policy retrenchment. Retrenchment means that the government is going to back out of public policy, that they don't want to have anything to do with it, that they're actually going to use it to make less policy. How? By, for example, not being avoidable, not being responsible for choices. If they really don't want to choose or they don't want to be responsible, they could just ask the people, and then they'll blame the people afterwards for what happened, right? Which is okay in democratic theory, but it's a way to have your hands off something. More importantly, participation can be a way to install neoliberalism. Neoliberal governments like participation a lot because it's a way to take power away from the government, A, but also to make people responsible and to actually do less, especially in the variant of co-creation, right? The example of the roads we gave. Oh, you want new roads? You build them yourself, right? You want daycare? Well, let's all come together and talk about how you in the neighborhood could organize daycare amongst each other, all right? Who's gonna take the kids on Tuesday? And somebody's gonna say, okay, you. And then you like make them all do something, and then you close the daycare, right? This is very common, that participation is used for the government to actually back out of something, and they'll try to make people responsible for it, right? In the most extreme case, in the almost ridiculous case that in Guerrero, they just give up on the police and they're like, you're self-defense force now. We're out. Bye. Good luck. Right? They're out. That's participation going wrong, right? So I'm often quite suspicious of participation exercise, especially when they involve co-production, because it often means that the government is trying not to do something, but still make it happen. And they always do this with poor people, right? You cannot imagine that in San Pedro, the mayor is like, let's make a new park. Here's a shovel, right? And that then people will actually come out of their houses to dig a tree. That's not even imaginable that that would happen. But it's very imaginable in a poor neighborhood that the government would do this and say, "Oh, you want a new park? Well, here's some plants. Good luck." And he's like, "Here's some water. Make it grow." So that's one pitfall. So I've told you a lot about participation, right? What do you think about the topic? Any reflections, opinions?
Yeah, I want to ask, like Mexico in comparison with another countries, well, I guess like we have very little participation, but how does participation looks in other parts of the world? Like, for example, in Belgium, they are more participative or not?
So Mexico's changing, right? And I think there's a clear move towards participation and government orientation happening right now. But in Belgium, the big difference, Belgium is a very strong civil society. So when participation happens, it's usually not between between the government and citizens. It's more between government and groups of citizens, like NGOs. So we have a lot of participatory processes, but they are like semi-lobbying in a way. So when governments make decisions, local governments in particular, they will very often ask the opinion of people who are involved in it, not of the public in general. So that's the type of participation we have a lot more of. And that can go very far onto like the level of the minimum wage is decided by participation of both syndicates and employers. And then they will propose, they don't decide it, but they will propose what it is each year to the government. But those are not like people on the street, right? These are people who are elected by those people in a separate system of syndicates, etc., etc. So we have a lot more of that. We sometimes have consultancies, but not a lot of them. They usually take place, well, the only ones I've ever known took place on a city scale. Our federal government doesn't have that much participation in it, no. But people are on average more interested in politics. People have a better understanding on average of the political spectrum. People are more political in Belgium. And it's not a forbidden topic at the table, let's say. But we can talk next time on examples of specific processes. I myself studied one in particular that has to do with poverty that I'll talk about next time. But I will share with you some policies that they do in different countries, and we can have a discussion about that if you like them or not. Mr. Hugo, any feedback or questions you might have? Okay.
I have a comment.
Okay.
That I have an example of how, as you said in the information part, how there are in some cases like this type of how do you say mechanisms of participation, but as long as we don't even know that they are there, we don't exercise them. For example, here in Nuevo León, there is this figure of social controllers, like a Contraloría in Spanish.
Okay.
And most of them are from the federal government. But if you want, you can go like to, I think it's the Comisión Estatal Electoral, the one that do this thing, and you can like join with some neighbors, do a social controller, and yeah, like how how do you say, being like checking how, for example, the how do you say this? If they're doing a like making a road in your neighborhood, this group of neighbors have all the competence and capacity to ask for them for financial information and all that stuff to avoid corruption. But there's no like promotion of these things.
Yeah. There's many ways for governments to suppress their own things. For example, let's say you have a meeting, you have to publicly advertise that, and you just hang it on some wall somewhere on a corner. Then you say, I publicized it. It was there. Like in some taco stand, you hang it there. So you legally complied with it, except nobody's going to notice, right? Because you didn't actually advertise it. You just, like, it was out there. You could have known if you saw it. There's various mechanisms of this. But often it's also citizens, right, that don't care. A big thing here is information. Nevleon has some, in recent years, has made a lot of progress when it comes to transparency and right to information. There's a lot you could ask the government about. My colleague Raul Alman works there. Do you know him? Probably had him as a teacher.
Raúl Alemán, our teacher?
Yes. You have him?
Yeah, I know him. Yeah, he is our teacher right now. And also he's friend of one friend of mine that works in ¿Cómo vamos, Nuevo León?
Well, he is very involved in practice, in citizen participation and the right to information. He probably talked about it.
Yeah.
If not, he will. Good. That's it then for today. I'm going to take it a little bit easy. We're just going to discuss things. We're going to make it participatory. Have you participate about participation? That's what we are going to do. Any other questions? Back to the course. No?
I don't think so.
Then I hope you guys can figure out what happened to the other Diego and to Sophia and hopefully bring them back alive. All right? Good.
Yeah.
Then I wish you a good Wednesday. Bye.
Okay. See
Bye.
you.
See you.